And on this session, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands in which we meet here today, with lots of lands represented in this call from across Australia. And I am on the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. It's around the region of the North Sydney region in Sydney. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I wanted to welcome you to this session. This is the first of these sessions that we run. It won't be the last. We're going to be running a few of these ones in the future. And I wanted to start. We're going to talk about embodied carbon today and the NABERS Embodied Carbon Initiative. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about what we think that this is a really important topic, and we're really thankful that you're here because it's a topic that a lot of you are really interested in, and I think a topic that we definitely need to talk more and do a lot more as a country. We all know that. We've been talking to a lot of you in the last few months in the early stages of this project. And I think one common topic and something that comes in almost every conversation we have about this is that there's been such a growth in the awareness of how important it is for the built environment in Australia to make significant progress on embodied carbon, how important that is, how hard that challenge is to do in the next 2-3 decades, and how much progress we need to make, how quickly. So there's been a real growth in awareness of the enormity of this challenge, and also that there's a lot of opportunity for Australia to be a world leader in this space. And also the fact that embodied carbon is actually not only a major source of emissions today in the built environment, but it's actually probably going to grow in terms of the proportion of total emissions in buildings over the next couple of decades, because some of the other sources are actually declining, in particular electricity, because of the decarbonization of the electricity grid. So we all acknowledge that this is a really big topic, and I just wanted to say that explicitly because so many of you have been telling us that for the last few months, that we completely understand that, and a lot of us who are working in government, as well as a lot of you who are in industry, we know that we have to do as much as we can in the next 10 and 15, 20 years, and that we're going to need to try a lot of things, a lot of new things that we haven't done before, and also pull in some of the best things that we're doing in government and industry together to see how much progress can we make in this topic and how quickly can we do it. Before we jump into the presentation itself, there's one topic I wanted to cover quickly, which is a frequent question we get is like, why is NABERS working in this space? Isn't this like isn't that like a Green Star topic, embodied carbon? And I want to tell you a couple of things about that. The first of all is that this is a project that we have been working with Green Star from day one, even before day zero, when this was just an idea. So Green Star is a very close partner for us in this project, and we're working and coordinating all our actions with them. So in essence, this is almost like a joint project with the GBCA together. And partly it's because the scale of change needed in this space is so big. So it's actually this great work happening in embodied carbon in Australia, but we are also very, very far from driving the scale of change we actually need to be able to tackle this issue in the next few decades. So a lot of our early conversations with the GBCA and with a lot of people in the industry have been about how fast we actually need to scale up this work, and how do we do that in a way that we can create nationally consistent frameworks where a lot of that innovation can happen very quickly. Basically, can we replicate and embodied carbon together what have we actually been able to do with industry and government in sectors like commercial buildings on the energy side, where we've seen perhaps the single fastest reduction of carbon emissions in the world in any building sector, in sectors like offices, shopping centers, a couple of sectors in Australia. And that's been off the back of really clear, consistent, predictable standards that allow people to make short-term, medium-term, long-term decisions. And it's been a real success of how Australia's been able to tackle these issues. It's about, can we actually bring all of those things together and do it in embodied carbon? Can we bring the best of industry and government? And how do we actually go about that? So this session is going to be around a lot about that. And I just wanted to tackle that issue that we are working with the GBCA. We actually want to drive a national consistent standard that is used by a lot of the initiatives that are in this space, not just for NABERS, but also by the GBCA and potentially other mechanisms as well. Now, I'm going to dive into the session now. I think the one thing that I'd like you to consider is that we have this really big diversity of people in this call. Some of you have been very involved and working really close with us For some of you, this might be the first time you actually hear about this project. So we're going to do a little bit of trying to bring a bit of uniform information to this group. So it's a couple of things that you might hear that you've heard before, but there's going to be a lot of things that you haven't, even if you work really closely with us, because we've been having lots of interviews and workshops with a lot of you, and we're actually going to be basically playing back and sharing a lot of the things that you have told us. And because there's a lot of variety and diversity, some of those things you'll probably agree, and a couple of things you might actually disagree, and that's okay. Because when there's a lot of diversity, there will be diversity on how people think we need to go about a project like this. The last thing I want to say, and I'm going to pass it on to some of my colleagues, is that this is a session, it's the first of its kind. So it's a session where we're going to talk a lot. Often we have a lot of sessions with a lot of more conversation, but we'll have some time at the end for questions. And also we'll try to answer questions in context as we go along. So if you have questions, please pop them on the chat and we'll try to answer as we can. We'll have a bit of time at the end as well to try to cover all the ones that we may not be able to do on the fly. And if we have lots of questions and we're out of time, that's okay too. We're going to answer every question. So if we don't have time to do it today, we're going to get back to you shortly afterwards with an answer to that question. Now, couple of housekeeping. If you feel comfortable about having your camera, we'd love to see all your bright faces on the other side. It's always good to know your reactions and how you feel about some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Please be respectful. I think people usually always are in these sessions. I think everyone comes into a project like this because they really care about the environment, and we all want to do as much as we can, as fast as we can. So please just be respectful with your comments and to your colleagues and other people in the industry. And we will be recording this meeting, so we are recording already. And once again, any questions you have, please ask them on the chat. If we can answer on the spot, we will, by the way. And if we don't, we'll just bring them to the end. With that said, I might just pass this on with my first colleague who's going to talk to you today, which is Arefe. Arefe, over to you.
Thanks, Carlos. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session. My name is Arefe Hesaraki. I'm a project officer at NABERS, and I'm working on Embodied Emissions project. And let's get started with a short description of what embodied emission is, just in case if anyone is new in this area. Embodied emissions refer to all greenhouse emissions released when making a product or service ready for consumption or use. And for buildings, this includes emissions relating to extraction of raw materials, transport of raw materials to manufacture, and manufacturing the building materials, transport to site, and construction activities in the site, and repairing, refurbishing, or replacing, which happens later in operation phase, and emissions that are released at the end of the life. There is a climate crisis, and we are at a critical time. And embodied emissions from buildings are significant, especially as the grids are less reliant on fossil fuels. Operational emissions will fall, and the need to reduce embodied emissions will become even more important. And significant embodied emissions in the next 10 years will come from building materials and constructions. So it is really important to address these emissions now. And tackling embodied emissions is critical, because as those emissions are released, then there's no way to go back. NABERS has an impressive track record of reducing operational emissions in a typical office buildings. Our data shows that the energy use intensity has been reduced by more than 30% in an average office building, which has been rated by NABERS for 10 consecutive years, which is significant. As NABERS has expertise and capabilities in benchmarking, earlier last year, the Minister of Energy and Environment in New South Wales asked us to look into a uniform and national framework for measuring, benchmarking, and verifying embodied emissions in buildings, and to leverage our experience in reducing carbon emissions. Our aim is to create a framework that can be adopted voluntarily and at scale. And of course, this work aims to build on what has already been done and what is working well, rather than starting from scratch, duplicating or reinventing the wheel. And we are working very closely with GBCA, Green Building Council of Australia, as Carlos said, and we will partner with others such as Commonwealth Government, MECLA, Basics, Design and Place, and others. And I would like to emphasize that the key part for us in this project is to collaborate, and we will co-design with industry, especially those who will use this tool. This project is a 2-year project, and for the first financial year, there are 2 work streams. One is market feasibility study, which is about understanding the market and what are the problems that we are going to solve and aligning with industry. And another work stream is technical analysis, in which we figure out how to do calculations, how to do benchmarks, and so on. And we are in market feasibility study now, and we will kick off technical analysis very soon, within a few weeks. These are different stages in our market feasibility studies. And initially, we began with market scan phase, in which we learned more about other embodied emissions tools. We interviewed different organizations such as eTool, One Click LCA, Basics, the Footprint Company, and so on. And then to align with industry and to understand their needs, we had many workshops with a wider range of stakeholders prior to Christmas. And based on the feedback that we got from stakeholders, we clarified NABERS objectives for this initiative. And in March, we will test some concepts of our tool with key stakeholders, and we will start with high-level ideas in the first round in the beginning of March, and then we will test more detailed concepts in the second round later in March. Yes, these logos give a visual representation of the companies we have spoken with so far. And so far, we have met 84 people from 52 organizations from Australia and overseas to understand their needs, their thinking and practices when it comes to reducing embodied emissions in buildings. We divided our stakeholder into 4 different groups. One is decision makers, including developers, owners, tenants. Another stakeholder group is project team, includes architects, engineers, quantity surveyors, construction, and LCA experts. We also had policymakers, investors, peak bodies, and academics as influencers. And in supply side, we had manufacturers. Now I would like to hand over to Nova to share learnings so far.
Thank you so much, Arife. My name's Nova. I work for Meld Studios, but I'm embedded with the NABERS team. Just a big thank you to everybody who's given us time so far. You've been incredibly generous with your time and your thoughts. And the idea now is to play back some of the things that we've heard from you along the way. So So let's start off with the state of the market, state of the embodied emissions market. So if you've played in this space, you will understand that the industry is incredibly fragmented. Everyone has a method that is robust and flawed and different. So it makes sense in the context of what they're doing, but it's not the same as what everybody else is doing. The emissions data in this space, the tools that are used to come up with the emissions associated with a project, the benchmarks that are used to compare between projects, and the standard methodology in which you would go about measuring emissions, it's really all over the place. So while in that second point, the point is that there are many people doing a great job, there's just no general agreement in how that all comes together. And then unlike the work that NABERS does in the operational space, which is complicated, this is complicated to a much greater extent, and many decisions and assumptions will need to be made along the way. So if you've been working in this space, none of this is going to be a surprise to you. We've got some quotes there from an LCA expert. It's just so splintered. From local government, there is no publicly available verified industry agreed set of tools anywhere in the world. And from a separate LCA expert, in an operational building, you can check exactly how much energy is consumed and how much water. You can write a set of rules around that in terms of what you include or exclude. But life cycle assessment, which is what we do when we're looking at embodied emissions, is actually incredibly assumptions based. So a lot of assumptions rather than known knowns. Next slide, please. So we did speak to 52 organisations, and I think it's just worth putting a little caveat around that, the fact that the people we spoke to are the early adopters in this space. So, you know, we might hear slightly different things when the market's more mature and there are different people showing up. But at the moment, we can definitely say there's a huge amount of interest building. And even the fact that there's 120 people on this call really says something about the fact that people want to do something about their embodied emissions, or about embodied emissions in general. Next point, please. Influencers are getting some traction. So many of the conversations we had, people were saying, oh, well, I know that to get the money for my project in future, I'm going to need to show that I'm working on reduced embodied emissions. But we can also see that policymakers and local government, who we would consider to be influencers, are also starting to play in this space and get their heads around how this needs to work. Sorry, I live in the inner west on Wongal land, and there are many planes. I'm sure you can hear that one. Next point, please. We are starting to see some forward-thinking players making efforts to reduce their embodied emissions in buildings. So a lot of the different owners and developers that we spoke to have a way of measuring emissions, although, as I said, it's their own way, and you can't really compare what they're doing to what somebody else is doing. But there are a lot of people with goals, and there are a lot of people starting to make a start in this space, which is super exciting. And then the last point there is that the exception at this stage, and maybe it won't stay this way for long, but currently commercial tenants are the exception in this space. So we've only managed to speak to one commercial tenant. And when we've asked others, what do you think is going on there? What we're hearing is that tenants are mostly talking about circularity. This just doesn't seem to be on their radar yet. And this will come into play later on when we present some other findings. So next slide, please. So here are some quotes just to back up what we've said. From an investor, a lot of the drivers are coming from large institutional investors. From a standards body, amongst our membership, those who are best in class are already doing it. From a developer and owner, our suppliers are ready to help because they know that a lot of the big players would be demanding this in future. And the manufacturers we spoke to are also pretty clued in terms of what's happening here. From an industry peak body, all schools of architecture are now compelled to teach zero carbon design as a mandatory part of their programs. And then one final quote here, just to back up the point that there's a lot happening from a construction firm. We have an opportunity to trial new green products because government contracts want to be more sustainable. And just to kind of frame that, it's not just government contracts who are doing this. It's there are a lot of commercial projects as well who are going down this pathway. Next slide, please. Those we spoke with want to urgently lower emissions. So here are some quotes. It's about getting people to reduce the carbon footprint now. And then all of a sudden, the focus on embodied energy is going to be huge. And there's a whole sector that's not ready. Next slide, thank you. There's a strong desire for a fit for purpose NABERS embodied emissions framework, which is exciting. We entered this space not presuming that would be the case, but we are really hearing that people see NABERS playing a role in this space as long as what we do aligns with the predominant ways of thinking and others who are starting to play in this space. So someone to dictate what's in and what's out is important to focus our collective attention. Having one tool would help the whole industry to align its thinking, and a benchmark that is NABERS or government. So just some comments there. Further, we've heard, and we did specifically ask this question, that it's okay to iterate or evolve the framework over time. So we're hearing that about 95% of people that we've spoken to are saying, start with something, get going, hit the high notes, capture most emissions, but it doesn't have to capture everything right up front, because that will take a long time to get something perfect that can do that. So some comments here. We can focus everyone's collective attention on what's important now and then evolve. The key thing is that we try and move as quickly as we can to get started, and it won't be perfect and people will criticize it, but it's better to have a signal than to have nothing. So I think this is a really important framing for where we're about to go in March, where we start to test concepts. Next slide, please. The other thing that people are talking about is managing trade-offs with other factors. So people are talking about operational emissions. So an indicative quote, a building that performs well should have both low operational and low embodied emissions. Durability. Durable design is important, making sure the building can carry its function over its actual life cycle, and that it's a low maintenance and has quick repairability. So the idea that, you know, in order to lower emissions, you don't just build a really crappy building that has to, you know, basically have to keep rebuilding and fixing it along the way. The next one that we heard about is around circularity. Avoiding demolition is the new avoiding deforestation, and drive behaviours around the reuse of resources. And then there were several other things that came up, but not nearly as often. So people mentioned water use, biodiversity, building adaptability, and modern slavery. So we need to get our heads around how this might work. Are there actually other tools, schemes, policies that speak to these things? You know, do we actually build that into a NABERS framework? We don't normally do that with NABERS, so that's something that would be up for debate. Next slide, please. So we're going to do a quick poll. This is the first time we've experimented with polls, but there's currently 121 people on the line. So we thought this might be the best way to get a gauge on where you're at. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes, and if you wouldn't mind answering this one for us, and then we'll quickly pop up the results.
We just hit about a quarter of people responding to the survey. We'll just give a little bit more time so everyone, most people can respond, but we're getting there. A third up until this point.
And then one person's just put in the chat that they can't see the poll, so 2 people. So I'm really sorry, and I don't know how to fix that. But if you want to, you're more than welcome to put some comments into the chat. And the questions that we're asking there is, you know, does this resonate with you? What resonates the most? And have we missed or misunderstood anything? So does it resonate? What resonates most? And have we missed or misunderstood anything? We might just, given that I can still see people putting stuff in, so we'll give you another minute just to finish off what you're writing there, and then we'll share the responses.
And looks like quite a few people are not able to access the poll. I suspect it's likely the version of Zoom where it needs to be updated. That's what did the trick for me. So what we'll do is there are only 2 places where we do the poll. So don't worry about not being able to participate. And as Nova mentioned, just put your comments in the chat.
Yeah, and I just popped the question there as well. It's 3 questions, but you can answer in one comment if you want or separately. We're going to use all this feedback, and we're going to digest it slowly after the meeting anyway. So your comments will be heard.
All right, 2 more seconds just to finish writing, and then poll operator. I'm not sure. I think that's you, Supra. Would you mind displaying the results of the poll, please? So 65% of people saying this resonates strongly, 35% saying it mostly resonates. That's good. And nobody saying it doesn't really resonate. And then there's a whole lot of short answers. I can't see them on the screen. Supra, are you able to see if there are any themes that you can call out there, or is it just too crazy?
Yeah, no, I can't see the answers as well. I think we need to go to the HTML, like the Windows version. So maybe we skip that process now, unfortunately.
Okay, but we will definitely read very carefully everybody's response and take that into account and make adjustments where we can, because obviously this is about reflecting what you think. So thank you very much for that. I think we are up to the part of the presentation. We're keeping going. I'm still. Do you want to display the slides again? I think we'll keep going there. So thank you for your input. So we're moving now on to framework objectives. So what is it that this framework will do? And then we'll talk about principles. So how will we achieve this? So next slide, please. So 3 work in progress objectives. The first one is to support behaviour change to urgently reduce embodied emissions from construction and building materials across Australia. The next one is to focus primarily on measurement, verification, benchmarking and disclosure. Disclosure being my project has something from NABERS, maybe it's a star rating, maybe it's emissions, and whether I'm willing to share that with others and who and how that would be done. And a focus on the big wins first to be impactful as soon as possible and build on what already exists. So those are the work in progress objectives. Next slide, please. And then here are some design principles which are really based on your core needs. So next slide, please. So there's 6 of them. The first one is drive change leading to a real reduction in embodied emissions as soon as possible. So that ties directly into our objectives. Quotes, please. Drive people to actually do something, reduce as many emissions as possible. If you're getting into the assessment 12 months in, they can't change anything. And encouraging refurbs as opposed to demolitions with the aim of lowering embodied carbon. So that's the first one. The second one is, I think for the slides, collaborative. So nobody wants NABERS to do this without understanding the predominant ways of thinking, particularly what's going on and working well internationally, but also understanding what other green tools and schemes are doing. So as Carlos said at the beginning, we really are working lockstep with Green Star. We're meeting with Basics. We speak with MECLA and Climate Active, and there's also the Design and Place SEP that probably falls into that list, and some others as well. And it also needs to align with NABERS tools. There's no use having a judder moment there. Even though this is a slightly different beast, we will be trying to make sure that it feels like it's part of the same family and it makes sense as an experience that all the tools work together. So leveraging existing efforts, align the NABERS standards with other schemes so that we're not producing separate analyses. Next, the next one, I think that if we took every comment made on this project to date, and we looked at how many went towards a particular thing, about 25% of comments came down to this. So use a consistent approach, consistent assumptions. So around, how you approach this, how the type of data that you use, system boundaries. So what's included, what's not included, calculation methodology and data sources to produce reliable outputs. So that idea that, yes, there are a lot of assumptions that need to be made, but be very clear on what they are and consistently make them. So consistency is the fundamental challenge. Be consistent in what you're including and what you're not including. And as soon as there's debate about these numbers, it becomes highly problematic. So that's a quote from local government saying that, if we're pointing towards your tool and 2 people rate the same building and the numbers are completely different, then that is a real problem. And there's a problem even if the numbers can't be defended and somebody wants to take the matter to court. So that idea there from local government as well, really backing this up. Next slide, please. The tool also needs to be streamlined. So, and the framework as a whole. So what we're thinking there is we need to minimize effort and costs to engage with the framework. So some quotes to back this one up. Thorough and well done, but not too complex in the sense that people would just make something up instead of actually doing it, which is what we've heard can happen in other instances. Remove barriers in the tool and people will use it more frequently. As soon as you're getting to really detailed level, it's going to be a lot higher cost. And then this last one, integrations with industry standard software like Revit and other BIM tools. So those ones are architectural tools, but the idea of potentially integrating with enterprise-wide software like SAP, with the software that quantity surveyors use. So, you're actually getting away from that idea of manual input. The next one is trusted. Build confidence through a robust, transparent, and third-party verified framework. So the quotes there are, if 2 consultants work on it, they need to come up with a very similar result. So similar to the consistency one. There's a role for government to converge existing platforms or databases into one unified data set that's regulated. controlled and validated, and people can see all the calculations behind the scenes. And then the next one, which is the last one, outputs enable fair comparison and are easy to understand and communicate. So this is really about usability. And the quotes there are, you need to compare between your projects and other organizations' projects, and the terminology in the language is so tricky, there's a translation challenge. So hopefully with all the people on the call today, we haven't lost anyone, but it definitely is mind exploding stuff. And there's going to be a lot of people coming into this space. So we need to make sure we use the language that everybody understands. So those are the 6 core design principles that we have: impactful, collaborative, consistent, streamlined, trusted, and meaningful. And they speak to what people spoke about during our conversations before Christmas. Next slide, please. Second quick poll, same questions, we'll put them into the chat for those of you who can't access it. But if we launch that poll now, and we'll pop the questions in. Thanks, Carlos.
Yeah, if the poll didn't work for you, we just put the questions on the side so you can also type it on the chat. So we just had close to getting to 40% of people responding there and climbing rapidly. Also some really good comments starting to pop up on the chat. Thank you for that. Great. So now I think we're reaching a stable number. I think we have at least 60% of people responding to the poll. And we'll get into some of the detailed answers. I know that they're difficult to navigate 60 detailed answers in here, but we actually do read them one by one because there's a lot of gold on every one of those answers. So thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, so let's jump into the next section. I will pop the slides up. Actually, did we want to show the poll before we did that? Sorry. I can read it out. So 66% of people strongly agree that it resonates with them, and it mostly resonates with another 34%, which is great. And again, nobody saying not so much, which is whew, what a relief. And we'll look at your, lots of people have provided info on what resonated most, a lot of people, and there's about 30 people who are like, maybe you could, something's missing that you could consider. So we'll add that into our analysis. So thank you so much. Oh wow, you found a way to show. Thank you. Great. Okay. Can you, yeah, all right. So we're new at polls. We're better at research than we are at polls, thank goodness. But we will get better at polls as time goes on. Super, I think it might be over to you. Do you want to show the slide deck?
Sure, thanks Noah. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Supra, and I'm leading the project lead for the NABERS Embodied Emissions framework. So we've just got a few things to kind of talk about, and then we'll talk about next steps. Worth highlighting right now that there are some other items that also came up a fair bit as part of our market research. One part of that was guidance, so providing guidance to help people entering the space to get started, as well as providing guidance on potential embodied emissions reduction strategies. This might be a space that we may or may not play in, primarily because A, there might be other people or other organizations or initiatives who are better placed to address this, and B, some of them are already doing this, like GBC and the like, so we might just tap into them or point towards that. And then the second item that we heard a fair bit was emission information to inform design and procurement decisions as projects evolve. So the idea to incentivize or promote the behavior where embodied emissions are measured at different points of time, right through design, planning, design, and construction, and not just in one point of time at the very end, after the materials have been locked in, or the building has been constructed, where while you can verify the emissions, there is no point because you can't change the decisions made earlier. So that's what we want to incentivize. This is something that we will work closely on and look closely on to incorporate in our concepts and framework. And finally, we've got aggregated embodied emissions data across NABERS rated buildings, plus information on exemplar projects. So essentially looking at how we share data widely and also looking at case studies. Again, both of those on our radar, something that we've done previously, and definitely looking forward to do this as part of this framework as well. If you move on, I think the next step is, so in terms of next steps, so you've already seen this diagram before. So we are now nearing the end of setting our objectives or finalizing what they are. After that, in March is where we will come up with different concepts, or create the concepts that speak to the challenges and needs that we've collected to date, and then test concepts in March, starting with high level ideas in round 1, and then more detailed designs in round 2. Many of you are already involved, or you would have a calendar invite sitting in your inbox or in your calendar. Thank you again so much for helping out and giving us your time and wisdom. We are intentionally trying to keep the numbers slightly limited so that we do get more quality feedback. Having said that, if you would like to participate and you have not been, you don't have an email from us yet, please reach out. We are more than happy to work with you on this. And then looking forward, we will have another one of these shareback sessions, perhaps in April and June. Once we have completed the testing phase, we have a lot more sort of ideas on the granularity of the framework in terms of how we are proceeding with the calculation methodology, or where we are drawing the boundaries, what databases we follow, and all of that. So we will be in a position to test that out with this wider group as well at the time. That pretty much wraps up. Of course, I think it looks like we are going really well for time, so we will open it up for Q&A. But on top of that, if you, of course, have any other questions or would like to discuss this further, please feel free to directly get in touch. Carlos, over to you.
Yeah, so we have a bit of time, and so I think what I suggest we do is that if you have any questions, there's been lots of comments in the chat, but there haven't been that many questions, and so if anyone has any questions, we can actually spend a few minutes. The answer for some of these questions will be we don't know, and I just wanted to let you know that we're in the stage of the project where there's still quite a few open-ended questions, and then things will become, we have a lot more answers in 2 or 3 months from now, but even knowing that we don't have answers at this point is helpful. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to start with Mel, because you're right at the top left on my screen, and I'll be looking into, so raise your hand and I'll just be going in the order that people are raising their hands. Mel, over to you.
Hi guys, I'm the new public affairs person for RICS, and I just wanted to see a little bit more, or learn a little bit more. I know that we've been very happy to provide input, but we're tracking, obviously, ICMS 3, which is going to really revolutionise how a lot of these things are looked at around the world. And I just wanted a little bit more information about your thinking on that, and where you're heading.
Super.
I can take that one on. So starters, thanks, Mel. We have spoken with RICS as part of the tool scan piece to further understand, what your your work in this space, and clearly RICS and ICMS together are in many ways leaps and bounds ahead of a lot of other players so far, which is fantastic. I think the next step is to really for us to understand what should we endorse in terms of where we are drawing the boundaries, like as mentioned, like where we draw the boundaries, what methodology in terms of process life cycle assessment or hybrid life cycle assessment, what works best for us and fits our use, what databases do we kind of look for and all of that. So those are the decisions that we will make as part of the technical work stream that RFA talked about. And once we've sort of got some indication of that and we've tested that out, the next step will then be to look at partnerships and looking at, okay, who are the players already who are providing these solutions already, and just tapping into their sort of brains and their work, and then looking at how we can roll that out and make that scalable across Australia. Does that answer your question, Mel?
Absolutely, and happy to assist in relation to that. Yeah, so feel free to contact me at any time.
Fantastic.
We will do. Thank you so much, Mel. We can go first with David and then Erica. David.
Yes, thanks. And briefing was excellent front end. Thanks for that. I'm wondering whether the development team has got a sense already of the boundaries of the materials that would be in and the materials that would be out. I mean, my gut feeling is that isn't too hard to establish for a first shot of this with an iteration in 2-3 years time. But is there a sense that we can reasonably quickly arrive at those materials and a degree of construction, bare walls or fit out? How are you going with that boundary, actually physical boundary thinking?
David, I'll repeat your question a little bit because your audio, the first half was a little bit low, but the question is about boundaries, like what's actually included, how much of the building itself are we covering at the beginning, how do we actually set that scope? And so I hope that I'm not just destroying your question too much, David, but it was along those lines. Scope, what's included, and how much progress are we making towards that? And Super, I might throw that to you again.
Yeah, that's a good question, David. And like I'll just kind of preface all of this by saying that we will still test this, and the technical analysis will work on this, and we will finalize it. So we haven't landed on any particular decision yet. But I think there are two, when it comes to framework boundaries, there are two items to consider. One is framework boundaries in terms of the life cycle stages that we will consider. So, are we only focusing on upfront carbon? Are we looking at operational carbon, which we already do as part of our tools? What do we do about demolition? So there's that piece of the information. And the second is what you also mentioned, which is particularly along the lines of specific building elements or materials. And what is in and out on what we consider on those lines. So on the first round, in terms of what building life cycle stages are we considering? So right now, the significant feedback that we've got so far indicates us towards focusing primarily on the upfront carbon. So looking at right up until the as-built stage. So planning, design, and construction, and looking and focusing on that. That relates to a bit of us kind of the notion of the principle of getting started and not and essentially focusing on progress over perfection. So looking at something that is fairly in the realm of embodied carbon, fairly easy to do. So that's number one. And also the idea being that we want to target emissions that will come up in the next decade in particular, and the idea is that the emissions will come from the upfront carbon of the buildings that are being constructed in the next 10 years, and that's what we want to tackle. So that's that first answer to in terms of where the life cycle stages that we are focusing on right now or will focus on. And to the second, in terms of building materials, I think what the feedback we've got so far is more on the lines of the building elements, in the sense of envelope is in, structure is in, fit outs likely out or will likely be out again, because as Nova mentioned, tenancy, not a lot of interest yet. And also in the larger scheme of things, they are a small chunk of the carbon when it comes to just looking at upfront carbon or up until the as-built carbon. So yeah, and then services also in as of now. So yeah, that's kind of where we are in on that question, David.
And obviously, there's a lot of devil on the question about scope, and obviously that's also one of the things that we're going to be exploring in a lot of detail over the next few phases. So if you have a lot of ideas in that space, we really want to talk to you. So please feel free to reach out. Erica.
Hi, thanks, Carlos. I'm Erica Kenner. I'm from the Australian Building Codes Board, and I did just notice on the chat a question scroll past about a minute ago saying, has the ABCB expressed an interest? Well, I guess you can take the fact that there are a couple of us ABC people on the call as indicating that we have expressed an interest, but probably it's at very early stages and can't really give you many more specifics than that. But I actually had a question, and I am very new to this space, but I was interested to note that you found a trade-off between embodied emissions and circularity. Just because your scope definition for embodied emissions included end of life and extraction, I would have thought that that should mean it's kind of complementary to circularity rather than in conflict or something that needs to trade off. So I just wondered if you could explain that a little bit more, please.
Yeah, happy to dive on this one as well. And by the way, Carlos, Nova, RFA, just jump in if I miss anything. I think the idea is it's more perhaps on the way we've defined embodied emissions is essentially sticking with what the kind of the current definitions are. But then as the kind of conversations gradually went through, like, when we had an understanding of, the idea would be to focus primarily on upfront carbon. So that's where these trade-offs happen, is where if we do decide to kind of limit our scope to just one section of the building life cycle, that's when these the trade-off between like durability, circularity of what happens towards the end, like all of those things will need to be considered, and the idea would be to look at whether that is something that we can do fairly easily, and is it technically feasible to do that. Yeah, essentially.
And Eric, I think the one thing that I would add to that is that I don't think we should, I think we're suggesting that circularity and embodied emissions are in conflict. I think the thing to keep in mind, though, is that they are in a building. There are multiple different environmental impacts of buildings, and there are strategies that you can take that actually have a positive impact on one side and sometimes a negative impact on another. If you want to take it into another less contentious space, think of energy and water in cooling towers. That's something that can save you energy but uses water. So those kind of intersections between different environmental impacts can and will happen. And there are things in this space that certainly are good for in terms of circularity and in terms of embodied emissions. And there's also some strategies that might actually, help one side, but actually have a negative consequence on that. I don't think we're trying to gloss over of those, but our intention usually is about actually making all of that really transparent. And it's one of the complexities that we have to navigate in this project. And you did go into the topic of scope in terms of, in a different perspective than David, in terms of like length. Like, how far forward do we go into that? There's a lot of diversity of comments when we've been asking that question around this diversity in those responses. Everyone agrees that upfront emissions should be covered because it's the majority of emissions. And then from that point, there's a lot of diversity as to what happens then. And it's also an area that we're going to be covering into how far do we go in this first inception, and how much do we actually consider either doing in subsequent years or through complementary initiatives as well. So all of that is the kind of detail that we'll be working on the next few months. We have the next question from Angela.
Yes, thanks, Carlos. So I had two questions. One of it was something similar to what Eric had just asked, in how the tool would treat an end of life, or would it do an end-of-life analysis of all the materials that are coming on to or contribute to the embodied carbon? So since that is aside, my other question was regarding, and I'm coming from the Net Zero Government perspective, when we try to drive emission reductions, especially in the building sector across government portfolios, one of the major questions that comes is the upfront cost related to having a premium product versus a conventional one. And I just wanted to understand from your previous participation with, I believe, Commonwealth Bank, I remember seeing the logo there. So have you had any discussions with, the finance sector and how we can potentially unlock finances to negate that upfront cost barrier that such an implementation could have?
We have had sessions. So we've spoken to a bunch of investors or people working in this investment space in terms of how much of a challenge or focus embodied emissions are. Nova, putting you on the spot, can you give us some key outputs of those meetings? Sorry, I can't recall any off the top of my head. Immediate outcomes. Apologies.
That is okay. So what we're hearing, we spoke to the CEFC, we spoke to CommBank, and we spoke to another group who collect, it's very difficult to explain what they do, but they're kind of a middleman solution provider in the finance space. And what they're all not the CFC, but the others are pretty early days in terms of what they're thinking. So they were like, yes, we need information. What information? Not exactly quite sure yet, but it needs to be workable from point of view of something like a climate active certification overall for our property, or a green certification overall that could be Australian or overseas. So those were the main insights that came from our work with them. So yes, we need the info, but not quite sure just yet. We do have them down as one of the stakeholders to test concepts with as we go forward. So whether they're thinking we'll develop by then, by March, not quite sure, but we've got them in the loop for now.
And while we wait for maybe the next person, there's no one with your hand up. So if you have a question, feel free to do that. But the one thing I'll just add to that, like to add to that, is that the finance sector does have a role to play in all of this, but the actual only way to reduce costs in the long term, like if you want to see tens of thousands of buildings using embodied carbon as a meaningful design constraint in 5 years' time, the only way to reduce costs is actually creating markets for products, or for more inventive design where maybe you need to use less of some of the more carbon intensive products. You actually need to create markets, and markets are developed with smaller groups and growing that group to the next level and the next level. And I think that is why I personally believe that creating national consistent frameworks is so important, because it allows a market to start and grow consistently. And I think that is, you see that in renewables. We've seen how creating a market, how much that can drive costs down after a few years. We've seen that in batteries in the last few years, and we're actually going to see it in any product. But if you don't actually create a space for that demand for more sustainable products or better, more ambitious design solutions, it's actually really hard for that market to grow. And we've seen that, for example, in heat pumps in Australia. It's been slow at the beginning, not because heat pumps don't exist. They exist in Europe and they're much cheaper to install than in Australia, but the market is small. So a lot of the work is like, let's grow the market and the price will come down. So that's just one perspective. It's not the only barrier, but I just wanted to throw it in there. Does anyone have, I don't see anyone with your hand up. If you are, I apologize. It might be just a glitch in my screen. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions that you'd like to share at this session? I know it's the first of many sessions, so it's not going to be the last opportunity we have to talk about this. But if you had a lingering question there, we have one from Rob Bunting from South Australia Health. Rob.
Carlos, I was just wondering, it's an alliance formed by the New South Wales Government, the materials.
MECLA,
yeah. Are you able to give us an update on what that is? It sounds to me like it's something New South Wales are really taking a lead on this. Are you able to give us a 1 minute overview?
I could. It's a project that we are involved in, but actually I think we may have someone from MECLA in at this meeting. Am I right about that?
You are, Monica.
Monica, are you here? I thought I saw your name before. I think we may or may not have that. So MECLA.
Carlos, I think Alberto's on the line as well.
I'm also here, Caroline.
Caroline.
Yeah, how are you, Carlos?
I'm great. Great to hear from you. Sorry for putting you on the spot like this.
That's all right.
But would you be able to provide a high level description of what MECLA is and where it's at? There's been a lot of things happening in the last 6 to 12 months.
A lot of things. Yeah, a lot of things. So MECLA has come together through obviously state government funding. The idea is to bring all of the different players of the construction industry together to try and progress understanding of materials carbon, and also to look at, well, how does uptake get accelerated through various mechanisms. There are a number of different working parties, including individual material working groups, aluminium, steel, timber, etc., as well as a couple of other key groups, one which is looking at information gaps in the market, how can they be addressed, another which is one that I chair, which is all about the measurement approaches at both the material level but also the building level, trying to be very clear to distinguish between the two layers, because there are different needs from both those different levels and how they play out. It's covering individual materials, buildings and infrastructure, And I mean, it's certainly worthwhile. I mean, I can see Jeff Oatman on here. Jeff, you're part of in one of the steering groups there. It's a huge collaboration of people. I think at this point in time, there's quite a lot of information around. There's a website now up and running, which I'm sure there you go, there's a website up on there. Thanks, Vincent. And it's really about trying to share information and grow. The key group I'm in is really now is really looking at focusing on how do we get measurement understanding of the issues associated with all the different measurements and data and all that sort of stuff, and what's sort of potentially things that can be done to progress and improve on that particular point that obviously a number of people have already raised some comments on around that. So, and I think Carlos, a number of your crew, Supercheck is in that as well. So it's worthwhile reaching out to Monica and the MECLA team and connecting just to keep in the loop in terms of sort of outcomes and progress.
I think it's fantastic. And thanks so much, Caroline. You were so much clearer than I would have been in that. And it's just been, on the one hand, I feel MECLA is not only a wonderful initiative, but on itself, it's a demonstration of how many people really care about the space and just how much momentum there is. And if you're not involved and you're interested in this space and you haven't been active on that, I strongly encourage you to participate. Rob, part of your question made me think about a little bit about this group. We're working kind of on two fronts. We're doing a lot of interview sessions and a lot of consultation through big groups like this, and also one-on-one interviews. But also there's like a secondary group that we're working with, which is within the NABERS steering committee. And the NABERS steering committee, actually, there are organizations representing the great majority. It's always hard to say everybody, but the great majority of people here. There's every state government and the Australian government seat in the NABERS steering committee. And there's also 14 big industry bodies, including the GBCA, the Property Council, the Australian Institute of Architects, and so on. It's 14 big industry bodies, and all of them are actually really interested in this project in providing feedback at that level. So if you want to be involved in the granular detail, we'd love to work with you and we'll have that mechanism. But if you don't have the time, but you still want to be able to, to provide input into that process, you can also engage through some of those big industry bodies, and you can find them on our website as well as part of our governance, national governance. I believe that we're probably out of time if we had one more question. I know that there's a number of unresolved questions in the chat because there was lots of comments. It was difficult to follow all of them. But if you ask your question and we didn't respond, we will get back to you via email. We're also going to have the recording and the slides we use in this session shared with everybody. That's why you put your email at the beginning of this session when you sign into this. So you will be getting all of that. And if you have any questions at any point in time, we're here to work with you. We're really excited about this. We know that a lot of you are as well, and we really need your insights and expertise moving forward in this project. So, Supra, am I missing anything before we let everybody go to the days?
No, I think that's about it. And we'll keep you posted on the next meeting as well. We'll send across a calendar invite for April or June. So watch this space for that.
Great. Thanks so much for your time, everybody. And we look forward to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.